The Arab Stepmother, uncovering a shocking murder mystery in Egypt. Hook. Here's a strong hook for your YouTube video based on the story. What if everything you thought you knew about darkness was wrong? Imagine waking up to find that the very thing you fear is now inside you. A creature, a curse, an ancient power that cannot be erased, only controlled. Nadia's journey is about to take a deadly turn. Will she survive or become the darkness herself? Stick with me until the end, because the shocking truth will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about fear and fate. You won't believe what happens next. The night was thick with heat. The air felt heavy, suffocating. A soft breeze swirled, dust along the narrow streets. It was a silent evening, one where the shadows stretched long. No one had expected the horror that would unfold in the quiet home. Nadia stood in the doorway of the dark, dimly lit room. Her hand gripped the cold iron handle. She hesitated for a moment, her breath shallow. A faint smell of roses lingered in the air, mixed with something unpleasant. She opened the door slowly. Inside, the room seemed still, too still. Her stepmother, Layla, sat by the window, her figure casting a long shadow against the wall. Her face was half illuminated by the dim light of the dying lamp. Nadia's heartbeat quickened. Something wasn't right. Layla had always been strange. Her beauty was intoxicating, her presence overwhelming. But there was something more beneath her calm exterior, a hidden danger. As Nadia stepped inside, she noticed the room was eerily quiet. No sounds, not even the distant hum of the city. Layla didn't move, not a muscle. The air felt colder now. The smell of roses seemed stronger, almost choking. Nadia's heart pounded as she took a cautious step forward. She reached out to touch Layla's shoulder. The moment her fingers brushed the fabric of Layla's dress, the figure slumped forward. Layla's head fell, the lifeless body now resting against the chair. Nadia gasped. Her stomach turned. She backed away, stumbling. What had happened? What had Layla done? There was no blood, no signs of struggle, but the coldness in the air was undeniable. Nadia's mind raced. She remembered the warning, the whispers around the house, the rumors of strange things happening after dark. Her heart pounded. Could it be true? The door slammed shut behind her. The lock clicked. She was trapped. A chill ran down her spine. That Nadia's breath came in ragged gasps. Her hands shook as she searched for the light, but the bulb flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the walls. Her senses heightened, every little sound amplified in the silence. The walls seemed to close in around her. There's something in the air, a weight, a presence. The smell of roses mixed with a new scent, something metallic. Nadia's stomach churned. She needed to leave, but the door wouldn't open. Panic started to claw at her chest. Her mind raced, but her feet felt like they were stuck to the floor. A sudden movement caught her eye. She turned, her heart slamming in her chest. Layla's body was gone. Nadia blinked, confused. Where had it gone? She could have sworn it was just there. The room seemed alive now. The walls whispered. The shadows stretched longer. A cold wind swept through the room, and Nadia froze. A voice, a whisper, so faint she could barely hear it. Don't trust her, Nadia. Her breath caught in her throat. Layla's voice? No, it couldn't be, but it felt like it was. Who's there? She whispered, her voice trembling. Her mind spun with fear and confusion. Then, a sudden noise, the creak of a floorboard. She spun around. Layla's form emerged from the shadows. But this was not the Layla she knew. Her eyes were wide, pupils dilated. Her face twisted into a grotesque, unnatural smile. Nadia's blood ran cold. Her stepmother was no longer human. Run, Layla hissed, her voice low and guttural. The words were clear, but they carried a terrifying weight. Nadia stumbled backward, her heart hammering. She knew she needed to get out, but the room seemed endless now. The walls were closing in. She ran toward the door, but it was too late. The shadows moved around her, and before she could escape, a cold hand gripped her wrist. Nadia's pulse raced as the darkness seemed to swallow the room whole. Her father's voice echoed in her ears, his desperate plea to run. But the door was no longer an escape. It was sealed, bound by something she couldn't understand. She spun around, her eyes darting to Layla. The figure in front of her was no longer human, just a twisted version of the woman she once called Stepmother. Layla's mouth opened wide, as though to speak, but only a low, guttural sound escaped. Nadia's breath came faster. The walls seemed to close in tighter. She was suffocating, trapped between Layla's dark presence and the swirling shadows. Her father was backing away, his face a mask of terror. "I never should have brought you here," he muttered, his voice trembling. But before he could say more, Layla's hand shot out, faster than Nadia could blink. Her father was thrown across the room, crashing into the wall with a sickening thud. He lay still, his body crumpled. A thick silence followed. Nadia's eyes locked onto her father's unmoving form. Her heart dropped. She wanted to scream, but no sound would come. Her legs felt weak, but she knew she had to move, had to do something. Layla turned her attention to Nadia, her smile now a grotesque, mocking mask. "You should have stayed away, Nadia," she hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "The curse cannot be broken. The pact is sealed." Tears blurred Nadia's vision, but her body moved on its own. She had to survive. She had to get out. Her fingers brushed against the wall, searching for anything to help her escape. But there was nothing. Layla was coming closer now, her eyes glowing like embers. Every step she took seemed to echo in Nadia's ears. And then, in the corner of the room, Nadia saw it. A small, glimmering object in the shadows, half hidden behind an old, broken chair. It was a knife. Without thinking, Nadia grabbed it. Her hands were slick with sweat, but she gripped it tight. The sharp metal felt heavy, dangerous. She turned to face Layla, heart racing. "You won't take me," she whispered through clenched teeth. Layla laughed, a sickening sound that echoed around her. "I already have," she snarled. The room seemed to spin. Layla lunged forward, faster than Nadia could react. But Nadia wasn't ready to give up. With a cry, she swung the knife, aiming straight for the heart of the creature who had once been her stepmother. The knife collided with something cold, something that didn't feel human. Layla let out a high-pitched screech, her body jerking back. But the force of the blow didn't stop her. The blade had sunk deep, but there was no blood, just an unnatural blackness, like ink spreading through her skin. Nadia's hands trembled as she tried to pull the knife free, but Layla's grip on her arm was like iron, unyielding. The darkness seemed to pulse, and the shadows wrapped tighter around them both. Layla's twisted grin never faltered. "You think you can stop this?" she rasped, her voice chilling, unnatural. The shadows deepened around them, swirling like a storm. "You are nothing, just a pawn in the game." Nadia struggled, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She could feel the darkness crawling under her skin, seeping into her thoughts. It was suffocating. Layla's fingers tightened, and the pain shot through her arm. Nadia's vision blurred, and she screamed in agony. But in that moment, something inside her snapped. Her eyes locked onto Layla's, a flash of recognition. This wasn't her stepmother. It wasn't the woman who had once cared for her. This was something else. Something ancient. Something evil. With one last desperate effort, Nadia yanked the knife free. She swung it again, her body moving on pure instinct. This time, The blade found its mark, and Layla's body convulsed violently. The darkness around them seemed to scream, a howl that rattled the walls. Layla's twisted form collapsed to the ground, her body twitching as if it were fighting against its own death. Nadia staggered back, breathing heavily. Her hands were covered in black, sticky substance, her heart racing. But Layla, no. The thing that had once been Layla was still. The room seemed to go deathly quiet. The shadows that had once consumed everything now began to retreat. But Nadia knew the danger wasn't over. Layla was gone, but the darkness, the evil that had possessed her, was still lingering. Nadia turned to look at her father. He hadn't moved. Her breath hitched in her throat. Was he gone too? As she stepped toward him, the ground beneath her feet suddenly trembled. A low rumble filled the room. Nadia's heart skipped a beat. The darkness was fighting back. The rumble grew louder, the floor shaking beneath her feet. The air felt charged, like the very walls of the room were alive, twisting with energy. Nadia's heart raced, fear tightening her chest as she reached her father's side. His body was cold, lifeless. Her hands trembled as she checked for a pulse. There was none. She wanted to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the growing roar. The room was vibrating now, the shadows stirring around her like restless creatures. Nadia turned, eyes wide, searching for something, anything, that could save her. But there was no escape. The walls began to crack, dark fissures appearing where there had been none before. A deep, throaty growl echoed from the cracks, sending a wave of terror through her body. Then, the ground split open. A deep, gaping hole appeared right in the center of the room, as if the earth itself were tearing apart. The shadows poured out from the crack, swirling and writhing like living smoke. Nadia stumbled back, her body shaking uncontrollably. Her breath was shallow, her head spinning. She had to move. She had to escape. But the darkness reached for her, tendrils of shadow lashing out like claws. One of them grazed her arm, and she gasped in pain. It burned, a cold fire that seemed to sink into her very soul. Her legs felt weak, and she collapsed to the floor, her vision blurring. The darkness was closing in, but she refused to give in. She had to keep fighting. Through the chaos, she noticed something. In the far corner, where the shadows were thickest, there was a faint light, a glimmer of something. With every ounce of strength left in her body, Nadia crawled toward it, her breath ragged. The shadows clawed at her heels, pulling at her, but she kept pushing forward. The light was growing stronger now. It was a small, golden stone, glowing softly amidst the encroaching darkness. Nadia reached for it, her fingers brushing against the stone's surface. The moment her skin made contact, a surge of warmth flooded through her. It was as if the very air around her was shifting. The shadows recoiled. The ground trembled. But this time it wasn't the rumbling of destruction. It was something different. The stone began to glow brighter, casting an almost blinding light into the room. And as it did, the darkness began to retreat, crawling back into the crack in the earth. The shadows hissed and writhed, but the light was overpowering. Nadia held the stone tight, her fingers burning with its heat. She could feel the presence, whatever it was, struggling against the light. But she wasn't going to let go. Not now. Not when she was so close. The crack in the earth began to close, the shadows vanishing into the void. The rumble softened, and the oppressive weight in the room started to lift. Nadia's heart still raced, but now it was with hope. The light was winning. The darkness was fading, and in the silence that followed, Nadia knew she had won. The light faded, but its warmth lingered, still pulsing in Nadia's hands. The shadows that had once suffocated the room were gone, swallowed by the earth. The oppressive weight had lifted, leaving the space eerily still. Nadia breathed deeply, her chest heaving with the relief of survival. She dared not move at first, her senses on high alert. Had it truly ended? Was Layla gone for good? Slowly, she turned toward her father. His body was still lifeless, but the room felt different now, quieter, calmer. The light from the stone had softened the darkness in her heart, but the pain of loss remained. She reached for him, her fingers trembling as she checked his pulse again. This time, she felt something, a faint flutter, beneath her touch. Her heart stopped for a moment, then raced in hope. "Father," Nadia whispered, her voice barely audible. There was a slight movement beneath his chest. A breath, a shudder. His eyes fluttered open, slowly at first, then wide with confusion. "Nadia, what happened?" She couldn't answer at first, her mind still reeling from everything she had just witnessed. The room was no longer alive with terror, but there was still a heavy sadness in the air. Layla was gone, but the weight of everything that had happened, everything they had lost, lingered. I don't know." Nadia's voice cracked. "But we're alive." Her father tried to sit up, his hand weakly gripping her arm. "Nadia, you stopped it. You saved us." She looked down at the glowing stone still clenched in her hand. It was dim now, no longer pulsing with the fierce light that had driven the shadows away, but there was still a power in it, a quiet hum. "Is it over?" her father asked, glancing around the room, half expecting the shadows to return. Nadia nodded, though doubt crept into her mind. She wanted to believe it was over, but there was something about the stone that felt unfinished. But before she could speak, the ground beneath them trembled again, just a little. Nadia's heart skipped a beat, and her father's face fell, his grip tightening on her arm. I thought it was gone," he muttered, his voice shaking. A dark, unfamiliar noise echoed from the distance. It was faint at first, like a whisper carried on the wind, but the whisper grew louder. The stone in Nadia's hand vibrated. Something was stirring. The darkness wasn't gone. It was merely waiting. Nadia's pulse quickened. The horror was not over. Not yet. The whisper grew louder, more insistent. It seemed to echo from all sides, filling the room with an ominous hum. Nadia's heart hammered in her chest as she looked around, panic rising in her throat. She could feel it, the air thickening, the shadows creeping back. Her father's face was ashen, his eyes wide with dread. "We can't stay here," he said, his voice shaky. "We need to leave. Now." Nadia nodded, her hand still gripping the glowing stone. But the stone was pulsing again, its light flickering with an almost unnatural rhythm. She felt it. Something was coming. Something darker. The rumble underfoot intensified, and the shadows began to stretch across the walls, like fingers reaching from the corners. But this time, they weren't retreating. They were rising. "We have to get out of here," her father said again, urgency in his voice. "Whatever's happening, it's not over." Nadia felt it too, an overwhelming sense of dread. But she couldn't tear her eyes away from the darkness, the thick, inky shadows swirling together in the center of the room. The whispers were louder now, almost words, a language she couldn't understand, but felt deep in her bones. The stone in her hand grew warmer. A sharp, piercing light shot from it, brighter than before, almost blinding. Nadia stumbled back, shielding her eyes from the intense glow. For a brief moment, the shadows recoiled, as though repelled by the light. But the room shuddered again, and the darkness surged forward, stronger, angrier than ever. "Run, Nadia!" her father shouted, pushing her toward the door. But she couldn't move. The stone in her hand burned now, the heat unbearable, but her grip tightened around it. She could feel the pull, the force trying to take control. Something deep in the earth was calling to her, screaming for her to join it. But Nadia knew this was not a choice. It was survival. And if she didn't fight, Everything they had just escaped would drag them back into the abyss. Her father's voice snapped her back to reality. "Now, Nadia, please," he begged. In a moment of clarity, Nadia realized she couldn't run. Not yet. The stone, whatever power it held, was the only thing standing between them and whatever lay beyond the shadows. With a deep breath, she raised the stone high, the light bursting from it in a blinding wave. The shadows screeched, twisting violently as if in pain. Nadia felt her heart race as the whispers turned into growls, fury and hatred echoing through the walls. But she stood her ground, the stone burning hotter in her hand. She had to end this. She had to stop the darkness from claiming them all. And then, as the light from the stone grew so intense that it seemed to tear the room apart, Nadia heard a sound that shook her to the core. A voice, a familiar voice, Layla's voice. "It's not over," the voice echoed through the room, haunting and hollow. "Not over." Layla's words twisted in the air, like a curse that had no end. Nadia froze. The light from the stone dimmed for a moment, the oppressive weight of the voice pressing in on her chest. She turned in the direction of the sound, her heart pounding. "Layla," Nadia whispered, her voice trembling. But the shadows around her had grown, thick and menacing, swallowing the space between her and her father. Her father grabbed her arm, his grip frantic. "We have to go now." His eyes were wide with panic, but Nadia couldn't move. She couldn't tear her eyes from the swirling darkness. Then the air shifted. A coldness swept through the room, biting at her skin. The walls seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm, like a heartbeat that wasn't her own. The whispering intensified, the voices of countless souls merging together, filling every corner of the room. And then, through the veil of shadows, Nadia saw her. Layla stood at the center of the room, but this wasn't the woman she had known. Her eyes were black as the void, her body shrouded in tendrils of darkness, a twisted mockery of the woman she once was. "You shouldn't have killed me," Layla's voice hissed, echoing from every corner of the room. Nadia's blood ran cold. "You're the one. You're not Layla?" The creature that had once been her stepmother laughed, a sound that scraped against Nadia's sanity. "No," it hissed, stepping forward, its form shifting like liquid smoke. "I was never Layla. She was just a vessel, a puppet." Nadia's father backed away, eyes wide with horror. What are you?" he gasped. The thing that had been Layla grinned, its smile impossibly wide, stretching from ear to ear. "I am what you allowed me to be," it whispered. "The darkness you fed, the pact you made. You all set me free." Nadia clutched the stone, its warmth now burning through her skin. But the darkness around her was overwhelming. She couldn't feel her legs, couldn't breathe. Suddenly, the room seemed to tilt. The walls crumbled, the floor splintering beneath them, as if the entire world were collapsing in on itself. Nadia felt the pull of the darkness, dragging at her, threatening to consume her whole. "No!" Nadia screamed, struggling to keep her feet planted on the ground. She raised the stone high, its light flaring with renewed intensity. But the shadows only hissed, recoiling momentarily before surging forward again. Layla's twisted form reached out, and the darkness around them intensified, suffocating. "You can't stop me now, Nadia," it sneered. "You've awakened something far more powerful than you realize." The stone in Nadia's hand began to tremble violently, as if it were alive, as if it had a will of its own. Her heart raced, her mind spinning. She had to find a way to finish this. Before the darkness consumed everything, the stone burned with unbearable heat, its light flickering violently in Nadia's hand. Her fingers gripped it so tightly, her knuckles white, but she couldn't loosen her hold. The darkness surrounded her like an ocean, waves of cold, suffocating air crashing against her skin. Layla's distorted form moved closer, her voice crawling into Nadia's mind. "You can't stop me, child," Layla's voice echoed. "The pact is unbreakable. You are just a pawn, a fleeting moment in a cycle that will never end." Nadia felt the weight of those words press against her chest. She could feel the walls of the room closing in, the ground beneath her feet trembling, threatening to swallow her whole. Her breath came in sharp gasps. There had to be a way out. There had to be a way to destroy this, destroy her. With everything inside her screaming, Nadia closed her eyes for a moment. In the darkness behind her eyelids, she felt it. The energy of the stone, pulsing with a life of its own. The whispering voices from the shadows were growing louder, more frenzied, as if they were feeding off her fear. But then something shifted, a whisper within her mind, a memory of something her mother had once told her. Asterisk, you hold the power to choose, Nadia. No curse is unbreakable, only if you believe it is. Asterisk. Her heart skipped a beat. Nadia's eyes snapped open. Her mother's words echoed through her thoughts, filling her with sudden clarity. She did have a choice. This darkness, this evil, it didn't own her. It had no claim over her soul. "Layla, you were never meant to be my mother," Nadia whispered, her voice steady despite the terror. "You were never meant to be anyone's curse." The dark figure of Layla froze. The shadows around them wavered, as if struggling against the truth in Nadia's words. Nadia's grip on the stone tightened even more, the warmth intensifying, filling every fiber of her being with an undeniable force. With a guttural screech, Layla's twisted figure lunged forward, her hands reaching for Nadia. But the stone in Nadia's hand blazed with a white-hot light, brighter than the sun itself. The darkness recoiled, screeching in agony. Nadia stepped forward, lifting the stone high, and with a primal cry, she thrust it into the heart of the swirling shadows. The impact was immediate. The room exploded with light. The ground cracked, and a deafening roar filled the air as the darkness shattered into pieces, disintegrating into nothingness. For a moment, Nadia stood there, breathless, her heart pounding in her chest. The silence that followed was suffocating, oppressive in its stillness. The stone in her hand had stopped glowing, its power gone, leaving only a faint warmth. She turned slowly, searching for her father. He was still on the ground, but he was breathing, his face pale but alive. "Nadia," he whispered, his voice weak. You did it." Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't move toward him. Her gaze was fixed on the spot where Layla's form had once stood. The air was no longer thick with darkness. The silence felt almost too peaceful, too empty. But Nadia knew one thing for sure. The battle had been won. For now, Nadia's heart raced as she finally moved toward her father, kneeling beside him. Her hands trembled as she helped him sit up, relief flooding her chest. He was alive. He had survived. She looked around the room, her eyes scanning the empty corners where shadows once loomed. The air felt different now, lighter, almost normal. But there was a lingering sense of unease, as if the world was holding its breath, waiting. Her father's weak smile pulled her from her thoughts. "You did it, Nadia. You saved us. I don't know how you did it, but I'm so grateful. So proud." But his words felt distant. Nadia's mind kept circling back to what she had seen, what she had felt. The darkness was gone, yes, but she could still sense its presence lingering, buried deep inside the earth, as if it was just waiting for the right moment to return. Her father's voice broke through her reverie. "Let's go. We need to leave here. It's over now." Nadia nodded, but she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this wasn't the end. Something inside her, a deep primal instinct, told her that this wasn't over. Not completely. As they stood together, her father helping her walk toward the door, Nadia glanced back once more at the room. The shadows had disappeared, but the memory of them, of the darkness, of Layla, was burned into her mind. The whispering voice still echoed in the back of her thoughts. She turned to her father, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Do you think it's really over?" Her father paused. His gaze flickered, uncertainty creeping into his features. "I want to believe it is," he said quietly. "But you're right, Nadia. Something doesn't feel finished." Nadia's grip on his arm tightened. "What if it comes back?" Her father looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hope. "We'll fight it again, together." But Nadia wasn't so sure. She knew this darkness, this ancient evil, was far from gone. And though the stone had lost its power, the lingering sense of something, of someone watching, remained. They stepped into the hallway, the world outside still dark, but the oppressive weight had lifted. For now. But as Nadia glanced over her shoulder, something caught her eye. A shadow, fleeting but unmistakable. It was gone as quickly as it appeared. But in her gut, she knew she wasn't just seeing things. The darkness had been defeated, yes, but something more dangerous, something worse, was waiting. And one day, it would return. Nadia's blood ran cold at the fleeting shadow. Her heart skipped a beat, and she froze in place, staring at the spot where it had been. Her father didn't notice. He was focused on helping her move forward. But Nadia couldn't shake the feeling that something was there. Her mind raced, replaying everything that had happened. The power of the stone, the way Layla had twisted into something unrecognizable. And that whisper, asterisk, it's not over asterisk. Had she truly destroyed the darkness, or had she only bought them a little more time? "Father," Nadia began, her voice trembling. He turned to her, his expression softening with concern. "What is it, Nadia? Did you see it?" "The shadow, just now." Her words felt weak, almost desperate. But her father shook his head slowly. "Nadia, there's nothing there. You're just—" "I saw it." She cut him off, her voice more forceful than she intended. She had seen it. The shadow. The flicker of something watching them from the corner. The walls felt like they were closing in on her, the shadows stretching longer, darker. She couldn't breathe. Her instinct screamed at her to run, to get out of there, but she couldn't move. "Nadia, it's just the house," her father said again, more gently this time. But Nadia could feel it. Something wasn't just the house. The shadows seemed to be pulling at her, whispering again, softer this time, but more insistent. "Not over." The voice, familiar yet alien, was back. The floor beneath her feet shifted. And then the walls groaned again, louder, a sound that seemed to ripple through her entire body. Boom. The ground shook violently, as if something beneath the house was awakening. Nadia stumbled, grabbing onto her father for support. "No," she shouted, panic rising in her chest. "We need to leave. Now." But even as she spoke, a horrifying realization settled in her gut. It wasn't just the house. It was something else. Something beneath the earth. The shaking intensified. The doors rattled in their frames, and the windows shook. But in the distance, a low rumble echoed, growing louder. The darkness wasn't gone. It was waiting. Her father's face went pale as he pulled her towards the door. But Nadia knew they couldn't escape. Not now. Not like this. It was coming back. And this time, there was no stone to stop it. Suddenly, the ground cracked open beneath their feet. A deep, gaping fissure split the floor. From the depths below, a cold, suffocating wind rushed upward, carrying with it a chorus of whispers, louder now, maddened, calling for them. Nadia gasped, stepping back, but the crack spread, swallowing the hallway whole. The darkness rose from it, an unstoppable force, thicker than before, faster. This time, they weren't just facing a shadow. They were facing the heart of it, the source. And Nadia knew, deep down, that the final battle was only just beginning. The ground beneath their feet gave way, and Nadia's heart slammed against her ribcage. The fissure continued to widen, the darkness seeping out like liquid smoke, thick and hungry. Nadia grabbed her father's arm, her breath shallow, frantic. She could hear the whispers now, clearer, sharper, voices all speaking at once, an incomprehensible cacophony that gnawed at her sanity. "Father, we have to run," she cried, pulling him toward the door. But the hallway was no longer the familiar space she had known. The walls twisted and warped, as though the house itself were alive, bending to the will of the darkness. The air turned colder, suffocating, as the shadows crept closer, crawling across the floor like sentient tendrils. Her father stumbled behind her, his face stricken with fear. But it was the sound, the thudding sound, that made Nadia stop. It was faint at first, like distant footsteps, then louder, closer, and then a deep, resonating growl coming from the depths of the house, from the very bowels of the earth. Nadia turned her head, her eyes darting to the source of the noise. It wasn't the walls groaning or the house settling. It was something else. Something alive, ancient, and hungry. And then she saw it. A figure emerged from the fissure, not quite human, but not entirely something else either. It was like Layla, but not. Its form was blurry, flickering, a twisted parody of the woman Nadia had known. It was alive, but barely, like a shadow in the shape of flesh. The creature's eyes were nothing but voids, endless black, drawing in every bit of light around it. Its smile stretched impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged, sharp teeth, glinting in the faint light. It didn't speak, but Nadia could hear it. The voice was inside her head, a suffocating whisper of malice. "You cannot escape. You belong to me." Nadia's breath caught in her throat. The air turned heavy, thick with a sense of finality. The darkness was alive, and it had no intention of letting them go. "We have to move. Now," her father shouted, pulling her forward again. But Nadia didn't move. Her feet were frozen, her body unwilling to comply with the urgency in her father's voice. The creature, this thing that had once been Layla, was coming closer, its movements jerky and unnatural. Its whispers filled the air, wrapping around her like a vice. "You can't hide from what you've unleashed, child," the voice rasped, echoing in her skull. "It is in your blood, your bones. You are mine now." Her father's hands gripped her tighter, pulling her toward the door. But Nadia felt something shift in the air. The ground trembled again, this time with an unnatural force, like the earth itself was breaking apart. The house began to scream, a high-pitched, maddening shriek, as the walls buckled and the floors cracked. "Go. Nadia, please," her father yelled, desperation in his eyes. But the darkness was closing in, faster than she could run. The creature was right behind them, its presence like a suffocating weight. And then, in that moment, the stone, still clutched tightly in Nadia's hand, flared with a blinding light. The warmth flooded through her once more, stronger than before. It was the same power that had destroyed the darkness once, but this time it felt different, more intense, more alive. With a cry, Nadia thrust the stone forward, as though willing the light to push the creature back. The creature screeched, recoiling from the blinding beam. But it wasn't enough. The darkness fought back, writhing, twisting, clawing at her. Nadia's father grabbed her by the shoulders, his face twisted in fear. "You have to destroy it, Nadia. You have the power." But Nadia wasn't sure how much more power she had left. The creature let out one last, blood-curdling roar, and the ground beneath them split open even more, sending them both tumbling. Nadia closed her eyes, bracing for the worst. But in that instant, she knew. The power wasn't in the stone. It was in her. With a final surge of strength, she closed her hand around the stone and shouted into the darkness. "No more." The stone blazed with an unimaginable light, its power exploding out of her like a wave. And then silence for a long, deafening moment. There was nothing but silence. Nadia's entire body trembled with the aftermath of the explosion of light. The weight of the air around her felt impossibly heavy, as if the entire world had been holding its breath, waiting for the next move. Her heart pounded in her chest, her skin slick with sweat, but when she opened her eyes, nothing. The darkness had vanished. The creature, the whispers, the oppressive, suffocating air, all gone. Nadia's breath came in ragged gasps as she stood, her legs weak beneath her. She looked around, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. The house, once trembling with the force of the darkness, now stood eerily still. No shaking, no rumbling. The fissures in the floor had sealed themselves. The shadows that had clung to the walls had vanished. Her father, still beside her, was looking around in shock, his expression a mixture of disbelief and relief. "Nadia, we did it," he whispered, the words barely audible. Nadia didn't answer right away. She stepped forward cautiously, feeling the weight of the air slowly lifting. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the walls, as if searching for any remnants of the terror that had consumed them. But there was nothing. The stone, still glowing faintly in her hand, seemed to pulse with a quiet rhythm, as if it were alive, breathing with her. Nadia felt the faint echo of its power still coursing through her, but it was no longer the fiery, destructive force it had been moments before. It was calm. "It's over," Nadia said quietly, though a small part of her wasn't convinced. She turned to her father, her voice more certain. "It has to be." But even as the words left her lips, something deep inside her, an instinct she couldn't explain, told her otherwise. The creature was gone, yes, but there was something more, something darker still, that had been released. Her father placed a hand on her shoulder, breaking her from her thoughts. "We should leave, Nadia. We're safe. We have to go." Nadia nodded, but as they made their way toward the door, her eyes kept flicking to the corners of the house, as if expecting something to leap out of the shadows at any moment. But all was still. She told herself that the worst was over, that the darkness was gone. As they stepped outside into the cold, moonlit night, Nadia took a deep breath. The air felt different out here, fresher. The weight of the house, the weight of the darkness, had been left behind. Her father let out a long sigh, relief evident in his posture. But Nadia couldn't shake the unease that lingered deep inside her. The nightmare, she knew, was far from over. For a moment, she let her gaze linger on the horizon, the dark silhouette of the house standing against the night sky. The house that had once been a prison for the evil that had tried to consume them. And yet, the shadows at the edge of her vision shifted, just out of sight, just enough to make her heart skip. And Nadia realized, just then, that this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The cold night air bit at Nadia's skin, but it couldn't numb the growing sense of dread that curled in her gut. The house behind them stood silent, almost mocking in its stillness. But those shifting shadows, the ones at the very edge of her vision, refused to let her go. She turned her head sharply, but there was nothing there, just the empty stretch of land. But Nadia knew better than to trust her senses now. Something was out there. Something was waiting. "Let's go, Nadia," her father said softly, taking her hand and pulling her gently toward the car. His voice held the familiar comfort of home, but the uncertainty in his eyes betrayed him. He didn't believe it was over either. They climbed into the car, and her father started the engine, the engine's hum cutting through the stillness of the night. But as they pulled away from the house, Nadia couldn't stop looking back. The house seemed to be watching them, its dark windows like hollow eyes, empty but knowing. She didn't want to look. She shouldn't, but she couldn't help it. And then, for just a split second, she saw it. A figure in the window, a shape distorted and twisted, standing in the shadows. It was too far away to see clearly, but Nadia could feel its gaze on her. It wasn't Layla. This was something else. Something darker. She gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Dad," she cried, her voice trembling. "Did you see that?" But her father was looking straight ahead, his grip tight on the wheel. "No. There's nothing there, Nadia," he said, voice strained, as though he didn't want to acknowledge it. But Nadia knew what she saw. She knew it. The drive felt endless, the road stretching on forever. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was following them, that the darkness was still there, just out of reach, lurking in the corners of her mind. Her eyes darted back to the rearview mirror again. For a brief moment, she thought she saw the silhouette of a figure, just a shadow, but unmistakable in its shape. It was there, then it was gone. Nadia closed her eyes, shaking her head. Her father didn't notice, lost in his own thoughts, his hands gripping the wheel with a strength that betrayed his own fear. She couldn't tell him. She couldn't make him see what she was seeing. And then there was a noise, a loud, hollow thud that seemed to come from beneath the car. It made her jump in her seat, her heart leaping into her throat. "What was that?" she whispered. Her father's eyes widened, and he slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt. The world around them felt still, too still. For a moment, neither of them moved. The engine idled, the air outside thick with tension. Then Nadia's father slowly turned the car off, his face pale. Nadia's heart was pounding now, her thoughts scattered. "Dad," she whispered. There was a long pause. And then, from the darkness beyond the car, a low, guttural sound echoed. A growl, a hiss. Her father's face contorted in horror. "No," he whispered, more to himself than to Nadia. He opened his door slowly, fear written in every line of his face. "Stay in the car, Nadia. Lock the doors." But Nadia didn't listen. Something inside her, something desperate, told her that she couldn't stay in the car. She opened the door, ignoring her father's warning, and stepped out into the night. The growl grew louder, closer. It was almost like the earth itself was alive with malice, breathing in and out an ancient, terrifying force that they couldn't outrun. Then she saw it. From the woods at the edge of the road, a figure emerged. It was tall, too tall, with limbs that stretched unnaturally long. Its body was draped in shadow, flickering and shifting like smoke, but its eyes, those eyes, burned with a cold, dead intensity. Her father's voice cracked behind her. "Nadia, no." But Nadia couldn't move. Her legs were frozen, her body gripped by a primal fear she couldn't escape. The figure didn't move toward them immediately, but instead, it simply stood there watching. The growl was no longer just a sound. It was a presence, a threat. And as Nadia's eyes locked with the shadows, she understood. The darkness had never been gone. It had only been waiting. The figure in the darkness didn't move, but its presence was suffocating, pressing in from every side. Nadia's heart pounded so loudly she could feel it in her throat, in her ears, as the air around her grew colder, thicker. The shadows seemed to grow longer, stretching toward her, drawing her in with an invisible pull. Behind her, her father was shouting her name, but Nadia couldn't move. She couldn't look away from the thing in front of her. Its eyes, glowing like two voids, seemed to pull her in deeper, as if it were searching through her soul, unraveling her thoughts. Then, with a sudden, horrifying shift, the figure moved. Its long limbs creaked as it stepped forward, the ground beneath its feet cracking, groaning in protest. It didn't make a sound as it moved, but the growl in the air grew louder, more distorted, like an echo of something ancient. Nadia took a shaky step back, her breath freezing in her chest. It was real. This wasn't a nightmare. Her father's voice was frantic now. "Nadia, get back in the car. We need to go." but she couldn't move. Her body felt like it was stuck in a nightmare, frozen in place, powerless against the thing in front of her. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was something alive. The creature stopped a few feet away from her, its features becoming clearer in the dim light. Its face, if you could even call it that, was barely human, twisted and distorted, a mockery of something once real. Its eyes burned with a hollow, predatory hunger, and its mouth twisted into a grin that stretched far, too wide. "You cannot escape," it whispered, the words like cold fingers brushing against her skin. The voice was low, guttural, full of malice, but it was also strangely familiar, like an echo from the past, from something she had once known. Nadia's blood ran cold. She knew this voice. It was Layla's. But this wasn't Layla. This was something far worse. With a sudden, horrific realization, Nadia understood. This creature wasn't just a manifestation of the darkness. It was the source. The very thing that had been calling to her from the beginning, hiding beneath the house, beneath the earth. It had never left. It had been waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Her father lunged forward, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the car. "Nadia, move," he shouted. But as his hand touched her, something changed. The creature's eyes flickered, and it let out a bone-chilling scream. A pulse of darkness shot from its body, slamming into the ground like an explosion. The earth trembled, the air howled with an unnatural wind, and the car doors slammed shut on their own. They were trapped. Nadia gasped for breath as the darkness swirled around her. The creature took a step closer, its twisted grin widening as it loomed over them. It was almost as if the world itself was bending, warping, and the air smelled of decay, of something ancient and unholy. "You will never escape," the creature hissed again, its voice now all around them, vibrating in their bones. "It's mine." Her father's eyes were wild with fear. "We need to fight back, Nadia. Use the stone. Now." But Nadia didn't have the stone anymore. She had dropped it in the car when the ground started shaking. And now, the darkness was closing in too fast, too strong. Her hands trembled as she turned to her father, her voice barely a whisper. "It's not the stone anymore, Dad. It's me. It's in me." Before he could respond, the creature lunged forward, its grotesque, clawed hand reaching for her. In that instant, Nadia's heart screamed for escape. But as her father shielded her, the creature's hand passed through him like smoke, a twisted grin spreading across its face. Her father's eyes widened in shock. He staggered back, the life draining from his face, as if the darkness was devouring him from the inside out. "No," Nadia cried, grabbing his arm. But it was too late. The light in his eyes dimmed, and his body went limp. In an instant, the thing was gone. Her father crumpled to the ground, and the shadow that had once been an unstoppable force was now still. A final, cold whisper filled the air. "You will never be free." Nadia's legs buckled beneath her. Her chest heaved with the weight of the horror she had just witnessed. But in the quiet that followed, Nadia knew one thing for certain. This battle wasn't over. And this time, she would face it alone. Nadia knelt beside her father's lifeless body, the weight of the moment crushing her. Her hands trembled as she touched his cold skin, but the warmth of the creature's final whisper still lingered in the air, thick and suffocating. The silence around her was deafening. Everything felt wrong. Too still, her mind raced, the pain of losing her father threatening to overwhelm her. But amidst the overwhelming grief, something else stirred, a deep, primal sense of need. Need for revenge, need to stop this nightmare. She couldn't let her father's death be for nothing. Through the fog of her thoughts, the stone's faint glow pulsed in her palm. She had dropped it in the car, but now it was back, a small, yet undeniable presence in her hand. It hadn't been destroyed after all. It had simply waited. Nadia clenched her fingers around it, her breath catching in her throat. The warmth flooded back into her veins, her pulse syncing with the stone's rhythm. But this time it wasn't a comforting glow. It felt different, sharper, stronger, more alive. The shadows around her stirred again. The growl was back, the oppressive, suffocating force closing in. But this time, Nadia wasn't afraid. She couldn't afford to be. The darkness wanted her to break. It wanted her to fear it. But she had already lost everything. A whisper echoed in her mind, one she couldn't shake. You cannot escape. But this time, Nadia's voice was louder, stronger than it had ever been. This ends now. She stood, her legs shaking but her resolve hardening like steel. The stone in her hand flared with light, blinding and beautiful, and as it did, the earth beneath her feet rumbled. The darkness howled in fury. The creature's twisted form began to materialize again, but this time it wasn't standing in front of her. It was behind her. She could feel its presence creeping up, cold and suffocating, pressing against her skin like an iron weight. "Come then," she muttered under her breath, gritting her teeth. She wouldn't run. She wouldn't hide. She could hear the creature's low growl. It was inches from her now. Its breath, cold and rancid, ghosted over her neck. But Nadia spun around. In one fluid motion, she thrust the stone forward, holding it like a weapon. The light exploded from the stone with a deafening roar. The air around her vibrated, crackling with power. The force of it slammed into the creature, sending it reeling back. Its form flickered, distorted, like a broken image, but it quickly reformed, standing tall and towering over her once more. This wasn't enough. The ground beneath Nadia cracked open, and from the depths, another wave of darkness rose. The creature's eyes burned with rage. "You think you can stop me?" it hissed, its voice twisting into something almost human. Nadia gritted her teeth. "I'm not trying to stop you. I'm going to destroy you." With every ounce of strength, she thrust the stone forward once more. This time, there was no hesitation, no fear, only rage. The stone shattered in her hand, the light exploding outward in a blinding, deafening burst of energy. The creature's form wavered, trembled, before it let out a final, agonized shriek. The darkness around it began to dissipate, its shape cracking and breaking apart. Nadia didn't look away. She watched as the creature unraveled, piece by piece. The once dominating shadows shrank and disappeared, vanishing into the nothingness. And then, just like that, it was gone. The air was still again. No growls, no whispers, no shadows. Nadia collapsed to her knees, gasping for air, the remnants of the stone falling from her trembling hand. She felt utterly empty, but also relieved. She had done it. But even as the silence settled over her, there was a faint feeling deep in her bones, like a lingering echo. The darkness had been destroyed, yes, but part of it, part of the evil, had become part of her. It would always be there, just beneath the surface. Nadia closed her eyes. She had won, but the cost had been high. And she knew, deep down, the fight was far from over. The air around her was still, heavy with the residue of what had just occurred. Nadia's heart pounded in her chest, but the weight of the creature's presence was gone, at least for now. The ground was silent, the world holding its breath. The faint glow of the shattered stone was the only reminder of what had happened. She glanced down at her hands, still shaking, still feeling the heat of the stone's power. It was over, but it didn't feel like it. Not entirely. Nadia slowly stood, her legs unsteady. She had expected to feel victorious, to feel relief flood over her. But instead, there was only emptiness. Her father's body lay behind her, cold and unmoving. He was gone. Her eyes stung, but she refused to let the tears fall. Not now. Not when there was still so much to be done. She walked back to the car, her movements slow, deliberate, her feet dragging across the gravel. The car, too, stood silent. But there was something else in the air, a lingering sense of the unknown, as if something were waiting just out of sight. Nadia's skin prickled, a sharp reminder that this was far from over. She opened the car door and sat in the driver's seat. But the moment she started the engine, a chill ran down her spine. The car's headlights cast long shadows across the empty road ahead. For a moment, it almost felt like the creature was still with her, lurking in the corners of her vision. She gripped the wheel tighter. It was just her now, alone. Nadia's thoughts were a whirlwind as she drove, her eyes flicking to the rearview mirror every few seconds. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the darkness of the night pressing in from every side. Minutes passed, maybe hours, and the road stretched out before her like an endless void. But despite the feeling of freedom in the open road, Nadia knew she couldn't outrun what had happened. She couldn't escape the horrors of that house, nor the darkness that had been released. And that realization hit her like a thunderclap. This thing, whatever it was, wasn't gone. It couldn't be destroyed so easily. Nadia's grip on the wheel tightened again as the shadows outside seemed to grow longer, pressing closer to the edges of the headlights. There was no telling how long she could keep running. And what if the darkness followed her? She glanced to the passenger seat, where her father's absence was a cold, painful void. But the creature had been right about one thing. It was hers now, a part of her. Nadia wasn't sure what to do with that truth, how to fight against something that had already taken root so deep inside her. But she knew one thing. She couldn't stop. Not now. Not when there was still a part of her father left in the world. Still something to protect. She would keep fighting, even if it meant facing the darkness inside her. Nadia's eyes burned with a quiet, unwavering resolve. It wasn't over. It had just begun. Nadia pressed the gas pedal harder, her car slicing through the quiet night. The roads were empty, the world around her a blur of shadows and faint streetlights. She didn't know where she was going. She didn't care. The only thing that mattered was putting distance between herself and what had happened. But the deeper the silence grew, the more she felt it, like a pulse beating beneath her skin, a shadow that followed her every move. She could feel it creeping closer with every mile, its presence pressing into the corners of her mind. Her father's face flickered in her memory, his eyes wide with that final expression of terror. She clenched her jaw, pushing the thought away. She had to keep moving. The darkness couldn't follow her if she kept running. But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. It wasn't the creature she needed to outrun. It was the curse that now lived within her. That cold, ancient force that had been awakened when the stone shattered. It had been part of the creature, and now it was part of her. The road ahead twisted, and she felt her stomach churn. It was like the path was leading her somewhere, pulling her forward, even though she had no idea where she was going. She didn't have a destination. She just had the feeling that if she stopped, if she let her guard down for even a moment, it would catch up to her. Suddenly, the car swerved. Nadia gripped the wheel, her heart racing as the headlights illuminated something up ahead. A figure. She slammed on the brakes, her pulse racing, and the car screeched to a halt. The figure stood in the middle of the road, motionless, a dark silhouette against the night sky. Nadia's breath caught in her throat. It couldn't be real, but there it was, asterisk standing asterisk there, just beyond the reach of her headlights. A woman, a tall, thin figure dressed in black. Nadia's instinct screamed at her to drive away, to escape, but she couldn't. The figure didn't move, didn't flinch. It just stood there, staring at her. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the sound of Nadia's rapid breathing. She felt trapped, like the world was closing in on her, with no way out. Then the woman stepped forward. Slowly, deliberately, she crossed into the beam of the headlights, her face hidden in shadow, but her presence unmistakable. Something in Nadia stirred, a feeling she couldn't place, but one that made the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. The woman stopped just in front of the car, her eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Nadia could see nothing but the deep darkness of her silhouette, but she could feel the weight of those eyes piercing into her. Without thinking, Nadia reached for the door handle, her hand shaking. She had to know. She had to understand who this person was and why they were standing there waiting for her. But just before her hand could touch the door, the woman spoke. You cannot escape, Nadia *. The words, spoken softly, yet with such authority, sent a shiver down her spine. Her name, Nadia. She knew her name. Nadia froze. How? How could this stranger know her? The woman stepped closer, her figure seeming to distort, to shift, like something not entirely of this world. Her voice grew colder, more sinister. You are chosen, Nadia. Chosen to carry what others could not bear. The words hit her like a blow, and Nadia felt her chest tighten. What did she mean? What was she chosen for? Nadia tried to speak, but her throat felt tight, like the air itself was choking her. She tried to start the car, to drive away, but the engine wouldn't turn over. It was as if the very car, the very road beneath her, had stopped obeying her. The woman stepped closer still, until she was only a few feet from the car. Her eyes glowed, piercing through the shadows, as if she could see everything Nadia was trying to hide. You've awakened something, Nadia. Something older than you can comprehend. Nadia's pulse raced. The darkness, the curse, the stone. It was all connected. The woman leaned in, her face coming into view for the first time. Pale, ageless, with eyes that seemed to burn with a faint, unnatural light. And now it is too late, she whispered, her voice a chilling caress. Nadia couldn't breathe. She was suffocating, trapped in her own body, unable to break free from the weight of this woman's presence. Before she could react, the woman's lips curled into a smile, one that sent a ripple of dread down her spine. You are the darkness now, Nadia. With a final, cruel laugh, the woman vanished into the shadows, leaving Nadia alone in the middle of the road. The car's engine roared back to life, and the road before her stretched out again, as if nothing had ever happened. But Nadia knew. She knew this was just the beginning. The woman's words echoed in her mind. Too late. She wasn't running anymore. She was already inside the nightmare. Nadia's hands gripped the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity. The words of the woman rang in her ears like a death knell. You are the darkness now. Each heartbeat felt louder, more oppressive, as if the car itself was beginning to cave in on her. She couldn't shake the feeling that the road ahead was a lie. No matter how far she drove, the darkness would always be right behind her. And the woman, with her cold, otherworldly smile, was proof of that. Nadia's grip tightened on the wheel. She was being dragged toward something she couldn't understand but knew she couldn't escape. The car's headlights flickered as if in response to her thoughts, casting erratic shadows on the road ahead. Nadia glanced at the rearview mirror, the sensation of being watched crawling up her spine. Her pulse quickened. Something was following her. Something was closing in. The road stretched endlessly before her, an unbroken line of asphalt. But in her mind, it felt like she was spiraling deeper into the unknown, into the very core of the curse that had been awakened. Suddenly, a sharp crack split the air, like the sound of bones snapping under pressure. The car swerved, sending her heart into overdrive. A figure appeared in the distance. No, two figures standing on either side of the road. Their faces were too dark to see, but their presence was unmistakable. They were waiting for her. Panic surged within her, her instinct screaming at her to turn around, to flee. But the path ahead seemed to narrow, closing off every other option. The figures didn't move. They didn't have to. The feeling of being trapped was enough to push her to the edge. Nadia slammed the brakes, the tires screeching in protest, but the car stopped, dead in its tracks. She was paralyzed, unable to escape the suffocating feeling that had followed her all this way. The figures drew closer, and then the voice again, the woman's voice, cutting through the air like ice. There is nowhere left to run, Nadia *. Nadia's throat tightened. This was it. She was no longer the girl who had fought to survive. She was the darkness now. The realization hit her hard. And in that moment, as the figures reached her, the last piece of resistance inside her cracked. It was done. The car was silent, the air heavy and still. Nadia sat motionless, her hands still gripping the steering wheel, her heart thundering in her chest. The figures outside had stopped moving, but their presence loomed over her like a shadow that could never be outrun. Her thoughts spiraled. Was there truly nowhere left to go? No way to fight the dark force that had been awakened within her? She could feel the weight of it pressing against her chest, like an iron vice, suffocating her, urging her to surrender. But something inside her refused to let go. She wasn't ready to succumb. The figures slowly stepped forward, and as they did, the darkness around her seemed to fade, leaving only a quiet, unsettling calm. Nadia closed her eyes, inhaling deeply, searching for any shred of clarity. It wasn't too late to make a choice. She had to believe that. The woman's voice, cold and distant, whispered again. You were chosen. You were always meant for this *. Nadia felt her pulse quicken, but this time she fought the urge to panic. She opened her eyes, looking into the faces of the two figures, now standing just outside her window. They were not monsters. They were people, but they weren't like anyone she had ever known. "Who are you?" Nadia asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. The woman, the one who had first spoken, stepped forward, her gaze softening in a way that felt almost gentle. We are the keepers of the balance, Nadia. The darkness cannot be defeated, only understood *. Nadia felt something stir deep within her, a flicker of understanding. The curse, the power, the darkness. It wasn't meant to destroy her. It was meant to change her, to shape her into something new. The woman continued, her voice almost a comfort now. You are part of it now, but you can control it. You have the strength to wield it, or to release it. The realization settled in. The path she'd feared was not one of helplessness, but of choice. The darkness was not her enemy. It was her power. For the first time since the moment her world had shattered, Nadia felt a sense of peace. She could feel her father's presence, like a whisper of a memory, urging her forward. This was her legacy now. The darkness was hers to command. She took a deep breath, the weight lifting from her chest. She wasn't running anymore. She wasn't fighting. She was embracing what she had become. And with that, Nadia started the car once more. This time, the road ahead was not a path to escape, but a road of purpose. The figures faded into the darkness, their mission complete. And as the car drove into the night, the world seemed to breathe once again, the air lighter, the weight of fate finally shifting. Nadia had found her place in the balance, and for the first time she was ready.